So we have two panelists who are going to be offering their comments on the papers that we've heard this morning before we moved on to question and answers. The first of these is Catarina Tente from the Universidade Nova de Lisboa in Portugal. She again is a member of Ruralia and is the national representative for Portugal for Ruralia, and she's based in the Instituto de Estudos Medievais. And I apologise for my accent for all of these introductions, with the possible exception of the introduction for the next one. So the final panellist will be Professor Sam Turner at the University of Newcastle, where he's a professor of archaeology, co-director of the Newcastle University Centre for Landscape. And Sam is also a former editor of the Medieval Settlement Research Group. So we're really pleased to have panelists from two different perspectives to talk. So we'll hear from Catarina first, and then from Sam, and then I'll hand over to Aidan O'Sullivan, who will chair the question and answers. So, Catarina.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Are you listening to me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I wrote some lines that is easy for me because of the English, of course. And thank you to all the contributors that this morning led us to a trip to the south of Europe and the problems with preventive and survey and rescue archaeology. I just want to leave 2 or 3 ideas that have already been mentioned here with some extent. There is indeed a different impact in the regions on the image that we have been able to construct about archaeology of the medieval period from preventive and rescue archaeology. In South Europe, the phenomena of this kind of archaeology and the contribute to the construct of new narratives on human past is the later phenomena if we compare with the North European countries. Obviously, the impact of international conventions was crucial to the implementation of the preventive archaeology. And I have to say, for example, in Portugal, the pressure of the European Union was also crucial, mainly in the infrastructure projects that were financed by European money. Somehow, the rescue and preventive archaeology had in the last years a path that was similar but not equal to the one described by Jesus for Spain that we have heard before. There are relevant differences that I cannot discuss today, and is not the way the local to do it anyway. In Portugal, international conventions and the new law on historical and archaeological heritage date from 1985, like in Spain, and 2001. And also the already mentioned rules on European infrastructure investments imply the growth of preventive archaeology and also a creation of several private commercial companies that were and still are in Portugal the main actors in preventive archaeology. Well, I can say that all this situation in Portugal was very different from another countries, and somehow it was later than some of the cases that were described by Edith, by Paul, or by Jesus. The main moment in Portugal that changed the perspective in preventive archaeology was occurred in a dam that was being constructed in the north of Portugal. That is the Coa dossier. The study that was being made within the environmental impact of the dam ignored the importance of a Paleolithic Rupestrian art that would be affected by the construction of the dam and led to a huge and sometimes very asper public discussion with national and also international impact, and on the necessity to consider the results of preventive archaeology in the decision to build some infrastructural projects, and also the deficiencies in the management of archaeological heritage by the central authorities. I have to say that every country has its own ways of manage these preventive and rescue archaeology. archaeology and also the heritage, archaeological heritage, and in Portugal is very centralized. We have an institution that centralizes all the information on this kind of archaeology and also on the academic and research projects. Now, this episode on the Coas Dam happened in the middle of the 90s and led the creation of the Portuguese Institute of Archaeology, where I did some of my path in career. And that was an institution dedicated only to the archaeological heritage that worked until the 2007. And it brings us a very important moment in rescue and preventive archaeology, because it gives us some infrastructures to publish. That's very important. We have some of our authors, our colleagues this morning have underlined the problem of the publication and the disponibility of the information that is recovered in this kind of projects. And this institute had provided us a national database on these informations, on these data, on these reports, and also a national archive of this kind of information. It also developed the conditions to publish and provide a laboratory to support teams of archaeologists in studies of ecofacts, chemical, geologic analysis, and so on. Well, that stopped, and somehow the graphic that was shown by Jesus could be applied to Portugal, where we had a peak on the development of archaeology, the rescue archaeology, and also on also research projects during the beginnings of the 20s, and then the 21s, and then a decline in the last years. Like other colleagues have already mentioned this morning, also in Portugal, is not mandatory that the public and private contractors pay the studies and publications of the results. That's the huge problem, I think, of these approaches. This is, of course, one of the major problems of the development of new knowledge on human past using archaeological records. The other problem mentioned by Paul, for example, it is the disponibility of the records, of the reports, the records, and the diverse documentation that is produced during the field work. Sometimes it could take several years until the possibility to access that information. Also in Portugal, it's mainly in the academic context that some of the studies have been made, but there is always lots of problems to access information that other colleagues have stressed here today too. The information also to the collections of artifacts and ecofacts recovered in excavations made in this kind of environment. Nevertheless, it's not sufficient. A large amount of data is still unstudied, although we still have a national archaeological archives and database and so on. Saying all this, I have to stress that we had some new data on medieval archaeology recovered in the last 30 years in the preventive and rescue archaeology projects, mainly in urban, more in urban than in rural settlements, and none, virtually none, in agrarian records, somehow very different from the cases that our colleagues bring it today. But we cannot say that Portugal's this kind of archaeology led to a revolution on the knowledge of medieval past. This qualitative lap in our knowledge of medieval realities in Portugal, as we can see in many countries, in many European countries, I have to say the examples of France that bring by Edith, or the Jesus bring on Spain bring by Jesus, in Portugal is yet to be done. We did that change, virtual change, important change on the construction of medieval realities. The more relevant studies still come from academic research projects. To finish, I want to say that I can share some of the ideas proposed by Jesus for the improvement of the knowledge that can be produced by rescue and preventive works. One of the major issue is the economic situation, the necessity to have mandatory norms that can lead to the publishing and the study of the archaeological records recovered in rescue and preventive archaeology, and maybe we need to rethink the relations between commercial companies, central state, museums, and academic environments to be able to have a more positive way to study and to be able to study and to bring new data, new narratives on human past, and of course in the medieval context too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments, and really illuminating, interesting, and coming from another state again is absolutely brilliant. So I'm now going to ask Sam to step in with his comments, please. And again, if you have any questions at all or comments as an audience member, or indeed as a speaker or panelist, please type them into the chat, and then we can go through those in the last half an hour of the seminar. So Sam.
Hi, Corinta. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk. I am. You can see me now. Great. I just couldn't turn on my camera. Great. So Corinta asked me just to talk for 2 or 3 minutes, really, to capture some of the things which our panelists presented through these fantastic seminar contributions. The first, the most obvious thing which occurs to me, and I'm sure to many people listening, is just the sheer scale of the work which has been undertaken. A vast amount of new data uncovered relating to medieval settlements and the landscapes that they sit in. I was particularly struck, for example, listening to Andre's talk about how development archaeology has enabled the creation of new paradigms for understanding of the development of archaeology medieval archaeology in Croatia. Looking at that settlement at Velika Gorica Ševčovica, which was fantastic in terms of understanding the long-term occupation of that the site and the development of the settlement there. But as others have commented, I was also struck by this issue, which was raised by I think every single contributor, about the publication of publication from the excavations and other work that's been undertaken through this infrastructure archaeology. And also, I particularly was thinking about the issue of the publication of the data, because even if we don't have conventional publications, if we could access the data, then that would make it accessible to researchers to undertake work using, for example, techniques like artificial intelligence analysis of big data from these projects. And so, this is something which struck me as a potential priority to make the publications, but also the data, more accessible in future. Following on from that, another point which was mentioned by nearly everybody was the lack of common research frameworks or the creation of agendas for infrastructure archaeology in response to research frameworks. And I was just reflecting on personal experience or our experience, which is that there's a further difficulty, which is to influence the development of agendas for these major infrastructure projects. I'm thinking specifically of HS2 here in the UK, which is a large infrastructure project, but I know how hard it is to introduce, especially new approaches, new methods into these kind of large-scale infrastructure projects. And maybe this is something which we could include in developing research, try to include in developing research agendas in the future. reflecting on the kinds of things which perhaps we might look to try to achieve in the future based on this kind of work and using this kind of work. I mean, the most obvious thing that struck me was the potential for long-term diachronic connections in the landscape archaeology, thinking about how these medieval settlements are sitting within their surrounding landscapes, the field systems that they are within, and the importance of relating settlements that are currently occupied, something which came very strongly from Edith's presentation of the work from France, settlements that are currently occupied with deserted settlements and the territories in which they are set. I think there's fantastic scope, thinking about those territories more generally, to use geoarchaeological methods and paleoenvironmental methods to really begin to understand on a large scale the development and change of European medieval landscapes. Related to that, and something which we didn't really touch on, but which is very relevant for medieval settlement studies, are issues such as the potential for new work on material culture coming out of these settlements, or for the bioarchaeology. I was thinking about genetic studies, for example, from animal bones or from human bones. In fact, whilst I was listening to all the speakers, the scope for revolutionary PhD theses drawing on these huge amounts of data is just enormous. So really, we need some kind of research agendas to help us to focus that work. In summary, I was thinking really about how the coming challenges, which we know that we're facing, are going to impact on medieval settlement archaeology, and how, vice versa, the knowledge that we gain from medieval settlement archaeology will help us to address the coming challenges that we face. I'm thinking in particular of climate change and adaptability of landscapes to be better suited to manage the issues of climate change, issues of sustainability, for example, thinking about soil erosion and flooding. What kind of information that we're getting from these large-scale studies of landscapes, understanding how people have adapted to and managed landscapes in the past. What lessons are there for us going into the future? And conversely, thinking about how the infrastructure, which we know will be associated with future development, specifically thinking of things like wind turbines or solar power infrastructure, is going to impact on archaeology. So an example sprang to my mind from Turkey, where we were recently working with colleague Elif Koparal from Istanbul, where we were doing some survey in a rural area, visited a mountaintop 1 year, and it turned out to have not a medieval, but a Bronze Age small fort or watchtower on the top of it, returned the following year, and it had been completely flattened and replaced with a wind turbine. These are the kind of issues which, especially in countries like Turkey, where the speed and scale and impact of infrastructure development can be enormous, we really have issues thinking about how to best get information from the archaeology before it is destroyed. But perhaps the most interesting thing for me coming out of all of the talks was the scope for new regional comparisons, and to really understand how regions are different to one another and the similarities that they have across the continental scale of the whole of Europe. So I was really inspired, thought these were fantastically valuable contributions, and would really like to thank all the speakers and also Corinza for organising and chairing this event. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Sam. And it is very difficult to comment on the hoof on papers one's only just heard. And it's one reason where we're recording all these seminars. We can go back to them and listen through the thoughts and see the themes emerging. So it's really useful to have those comments and to see how these, both the opportunities and the challenges, the differences of the challenges in different areas, and the way that responses in some areas are able to present to us perhaps possible ways forward. And also very useful, Sam, last thought, to think about the future and not only how are we going to understand the development of settlement in the past better, but to what extent do we need to think about the future, both in terms of threats to rural settlement, but also how can it help us understand and mitigate change in the future. And that salutary example from Turkey is interesting. The final seminar will look at the sort of eastern areas of Europe. So we've just got about the last 25 minutes of the seminar. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Aidan O'Sullivan, who has very kindly agreed to chair the Q&A, which of course audience have been typing in questions. So if all speakers and perhaps panelists as well would like to switch on their cameras, assuming the Teams system doesn't collapse on the weight of that. Aidan will be able to take us through the questions and, of course, adding in any questions and comments you have yourself, Aidan. And Aidan, in fact, was one of the speakers in the first of these seminars talking about work in Ireland, which everyone who was involved in that seminar will, I'm sure, remember as a remarkably inspiring example of one state where actually some of this publication and synthesis work has been done. And I think it was immensely both inspiring, but also instructive, I think, to have seen that example where some of the issues that we've been talking about have actually been addressed, and the transformational impact that has on our understanding. But again, Ireland is not a state that has been immune from the challenges of the last decade, particularly we've all talked about the 2008 crash. Nobody's really talked about the sort of the current economic circumstance really in the sort of wake of COVID and the instability from the conflict in Ukraine and what that might throw up for the future. So it's great to have Aidan back in chairing the Q&A from that perspective. So Aidan, without any further waffle, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you. That was certainly not waffle. And I'm going to apologise to everybody in the same way as Corenza did. You know, I can barely pronounce English, being an Irish person. Well, according to the ways we don't speak it. But so I would be apologising for people's names for the mispronunciation or whatever. And just a very quick point. I was actually struck through all of that how very, very similar the scenarios are. And in some countries the scale is actually bigger, and the means of resolution are often quite different. But to be honest, if I was, I would think we have essentially dealt with that well in Ireland, and I wouldn't see publication and the dissemination of knowledge from our major infrastructural schemes on medieval archaeology is to be problematical. You know, I may be being too positive there, but I think Irish archaeology has dealt with it very well. Okay, so I was writing down the questions from people, so I'll just get straight to them, and then I have other questions that I can certainly make sure that all of the speakers can be asked questions, which is always a dispiriting thing not to be asked a question after a paper. So our first question is from Nick Korkos to Paul Arter, and essentially he's asking what the approaches of archaeologists to medieval archaeology in infrastructural projects. Paul, you seem to imply in the earlier part of your slides that you would be concerned by some of the approaches. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit more about your concerns about the approaches to medieval archaeology and infrastructure?
Absolutely. Thank you, Aidan. Yes, I was amused by Nick Korkos' remark because he pointed out, highlighted the word cavalier, which I used, sort of cavalier attitude amongst archaeologists and especially the government archaeologists, functionaries, and that is because, and I think in a sense I'm answering both questions to me, both Korkos and Winslade. Italy suffers very much from its classical past. And as most people will know, not just through the Renaissance, but also more recently with the nationalism of the fascist government and Mussolini, and I hope we're not going to go back to that sort of thing. But it does mean that we have a situation where in universities, medieval archaeology, which didn't exist before the mid-70s, now appears in most universities, but the archaeological teaching staff will be overridingly classical extraction, Greek and Roman, or pre-Roman local societies, Samnites, Etruscans, and what have you. I would say over 3/4 of staff will be teaching classical archaeology in one way or other, or have that sort of background. And this, of course, impacts upon the students who will then leave university. A number will become the hands-on archaeologists in things like the development run infrastructure projects. And so their eye is to classical archaeology. The same for the ministry functionaries, classical archaeology. So the cavalier attitude is largely due to the fact that if it's not classical, do we really need to waste much time on it? And that's very much linked to another, I think, very unfortunate thing, is that classical archaeology grew out of art history. So it meant that nice statues, mosaic floors, stone walls, and just the sort of thing that you don't have in medieval villages that you're likely to come across when you run a motorway through the lowlands, or even the uplands for that matter. So at that point, do we save the villa, or do we worry about the medieval village? Well, obvious answer to these people is we'll save the villa, which I think is absolutely the wrong way to go around about things. Certainly, it limits the longue durée vision of Winslade, but also because we know commensurately much more about Roman villas than we do about medieval villages. Now, one of my own research, my research agenda includes the analysis of medieval and especially DMVs, deserted medieval villages in southern Italy, and I am the only one, I believe, in three or four regions that has done anything like open area excavation of medieval villages. If you count the number of Roman villas that have been excavated, there are tens of, if not hundreds of them excavated, and many of them published. So we have an enormous deformity in our information, and I think we can only balance that, only try and get rid of that by having some sort of research agenda, saying, well, yes, we may have 1,000 villas and 2 medieval villages. How about stop worrying about Roman villas and telling people to dig medieval villages? Now, this is, of course, very, very, very hard to do, especially because against what people actually want to do. It's a matter also of investment. I mean, people are not going to invest very much in medieval villages when they have villas to I take village and villas. I can talk about various other classes of sites, but just as an example. So I don't really know the way around this at the moment. It's not it's the sort of thing you might be able to rectify, but you can't rectify in a very, very small, short space of time, unless you do it through legislation. But I can't see anybody passing a legislation saying that medieval villages in 2020 or 2022 are more important than the Roman villas. So that's why I say very cavalier attitude. You know, we must get through this quickly because we have more important things to do. If I move this on to the post-excavation phase, it gets even worse because, of course, things sort of filter through, and the more important things get through quite quickly. The least important things will have less time spent on them. The only thing that is coming out in a big way, as I tried to get through during my talk, are cemeteries, 6th and 7th century cemeteries that are the lovely Lombard and a few Gothic cemeteries with spectacular grave goods. We have again, hundreds of Lombard cemeteries now known, some of them extremely spectacular. I showed you one that had almost 900 burials. If we go and look at 8th century cemeteries, I only know one, well dated in southern Italy. It's a cemetery that came out with a lot of stiffs, no grave goods, and it was dated through C14 dating. So obviously there's deformity. I honestly don't know the best way to get around that. That's what I meant. That's my big concern, apart from the lack of publication in general.
Thank you, Paul. That was very interesting. Thank you very much. Our next question is for Andre, and it's from Edith. She basically makes the comment about being very struck by the fact that agricultural exploitation, agricultural development is subject to investigation, mitigation in Croatia, and very struck by that. Would you like to have a comment on that?
Well, there is actually two types of excavation. Well, not excavation, but it's agricultural exploitation, since the excavations are conducted only on viticulture and olive plantations. Since their planting is different than usual cultivation of crops. In the continental part, the crops are plowed at the depth of 40 to 50 centimeters, and the plantation of wines and olive trees go to 1 meter of depth. So when they struck sites, they are obliged to do the excavations. The thing is that they're also very rare, since most of the areas that are used as vineyards and olive plantations are already used. So when you expand your agricultural activities, you have to excavate, and these are mostly regionally influenced, mostly in Istria, since Istria is the richest region, so they have this enlargement of this type. But in Dalmatia, rarely, because most of the old fields are used, so they're not enlarging them. But as I said, in the continental part, there are no such interventions. And the problem there is that actually the protection of archaeological sites is not protecting the sites, but the cadastral plots themselves legally. So even when the plots are registered as cultural heritage prepared for construction, the conservation offices can stop the construction of the buildings. But when the plots are protected on agricultural soil, then there is practically no effect on it.
Very interesting. Not something we have in our part of the world. Thank you, Andre. The next question or comment comes for Jesus, and again from Edith. Very much agreeing with you, the link between economy and preventive archaeology, but also the need for a third partner in the legislators and the political will to make that change. Jesus, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question. I completely agree with that comment. I think that is like the first point of this question. So as you can see in the morning, the situation in different countries are completely different as well. But Spain is characterized because we have not a general legal framework. So it's a general legal framework, but very general. And Spain is a very decentralized country, and I think that this is why it was one of the main problems. So we in each autonomous community, in each region, the general framework is applied in a different way. So in some aspects, Spain is like country of countries, or there are a number of countries within the same country. I think that, for example, the situation in France is quite different. So depending on the country, I think that the situation changes. But I think anyway, it's a challenge, and we have to solve these problems because in this type of seminars, we conclude that we need to create this general framework, so combining research, combining law, combining the legal framework, combining companies and economy. So we have to look for solutions. Of course, we are academic, and I'm academic, so I do not have the legal solution, but I can expose the problem. And I think that, of course, politicians and legal experts in law have to look for a solution to solve that problem, because we are, as academics, we say that we have the question, so sometimes we don't have the answer. Sometimes we know how to look for the answer in a scientific way, but we need the support of the legal frameworks. And I think that is important, include them probably in this kind of seminars. Some people should have, I don't know, public servants or people who know, who are experts in that topic, but I honestly don't know well. So I don't know if I answered, but anyway.
Great. Okay, so I have a few questions that I was keeping for each speaker, so maybe I'll go through each one. Jesus, staying with you that fascinating graph you had about archaeology at the rhythm of capitalism and its crises, very, very striking, very interesting. Most graphs just show the curves of booms of discovery and bust, but you know, warm period, your formation, your warm period, and your dark ages. And yet, if you look at that graph, you do. I mean, we see a similar spike here in Ireland, but the graph for publication is just pretty steady, a slight rise, and you know, whatever, no great dramatic increase, and also no great dramatic decrease. So you know, we had an agricultural scientist here in Dublin who used to say, research is turning money into knowledge. And it's not turning money into data. So would you have any comments on the fact that publication never kept pace but never declined either?
As I said in saying, one of the advantages of the crisis was that some archaeologists that were private company archaeologists lost their job, so they looked for lateral solution for the situation. Some of them start to collaborate more with the academy, and the result was the publication of at least 3 interesting doctoral theses in the north of Spain. Paula Ballesteros in Galicia about medieval agrarian archaeology. Carlos Tejerizo, as I said in my presentation in the Guerra, but also Alfonso Victoria Escalera in the surroundings of Madrid. Yeah. But as I said, so I use that good examples, but as I said, they are the exception more than the rule. So there was not the increase of publication. So thanks to the crisis, we recover a small part of all of this huge record, but I think that we need to do more efforts. The problem now is that some of the archaeologists who excavated the settlements now are working in other jobs, or they have other jobs, so they are completely disconnected of academy or science or archaeology itself. So I think that is another problem. So the dispersion of the record, the different legal frameworks, and that the professionals are looking for their jobs. Some of them, only a small group, work in this doctoral thesis, and they have demonstrated that there is an enormous field to work, and there are an enormous quantity of data to recover and to transform into scientific knowledge. But it's a challenge. It's for me the main challenge.
Thank you very much, Jesus. Can I turn to Edith for France? Again, very striking ideas about how you can start to see regional differences in between enclosed settlements and open settlements and so on, and that this kind of thing is really only visible through large-scale investigations. But one of the points you made, and I didn't quite catch it, was how the increased numbers of radiocarbon dates starts to give you a much stronger sense of temporal chronological change, such as questions about the abandonment of settlements, the questions about the new creation of settlements, and so on. Do you see potential there for, big data mining of the large amounts of radiocarbon dates in French medieval archaeology? Is Edith there? It's not on my screen. Oh, here we go. There you go. Hiya. And you're on mute, I think.
Listen to me? Yes.
Can hear you now. Yeah.
Oh. Okay. I think it's we make a comparison. I think I transfer to this question, and I'm sorry. Do you listen to me?
Yeah, the potential of radiocarbon dates for looking at chronological change, particularly in terms of the abandonment of settlements.
Oh, I'm sorry, but I don't hear.
I'll type it into the chat and I'll move on to
Cool.
Sorry, we're both not hearing each other, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, look, I'm going to type it into the chat, and then I'll move to go back to here. Move to Andre. I think I'll ask you to see if I have another question for you here. Karenza, would you have a question on top of your head while I'm looking at this?
I think I'm sorry about the connection problems. I mean, given where we were all were a few years ago, the fact that we've managed to run a seminar like this without more communication connection problems. I think I think one of the thoughts that did come up, and the question in a way is that's coming up is, perhaps any speakers would like to comment on this, is whether we can draw together a sort of, we haven't really commented yet on the idea of a resource assessment. In the UK, we had a sort of series of sort of region by region moves during the 1990s and the 2000s to do, firstly, a resource assessment, which sort of synthesized the state of knowledge. And then drew up a research agenda which identified from the current state of knowledge what our priorities should be for the future in terms of what should the research agenda be there. And I wondered really whether all speakers feel that it would be useful to have a wider research agenda for rural settlement and infrastructure archaeology across Europe. What has been very striking, those who were have seen the early seminars, this sort of contrast between different regions of Europe, particularly the impact of the classical period in Southern Europe. And Paul has drawn attention to that very vividly, and it crops up as well in Andre's again, working in an area very much bounding the Mediterranean. I wondered if Jesus felt that a similar domination of classical might have been affecting work in Spain. So I guess there's a question to Jesus about whether the classical domination is also a problem in Spain, and if not, why not? And And then a wider question to everyone about whether we should be thinking about a sort of synthesizing resource assessment and research agenda for medieval settlement studies.
Might I just say something not concerning Spain, but concerning the problem of classical archaeology?
Yes.
I believe has somebody ever spoken about Greece? Has there been somebody? No.
No, but if the last seminar is going to be on Eastern Europe, we're trying to avoid a sort of East-West political, communist and non-communist divide. But the last seminar will be on Eastern Europe. We've got speakers from Hungary, from Poland, and from Austria. So would like to include another one from Eastern Europe. So if anyone knows of anyone who'd like to speak on Greece, I'd be very.
I might be able to give you somebody for Greece, to pass on somebody for Greece. But I believe the situation there is even worse than it is in southern Italy. I mean, the interesting thing about southern Italy is that the classical overburden is extremely strong in central and southern Italy. And the best medieval archaeology that's coming out of Italy is mainly in the north, apart from Tuscany, because of a series of people and factors. I mean, the University of Siena, basically. But the best medieval archaeology is north, from the Veneto, Piedmont, Lombardy to Liguria. And there, the classical overburden, even in terms of actual surviving structures, is a lot less than in the rest of the country. In southern Italy, it's compounded by the fact that it's not just Rome, but it's also Greece, because of Magna Graecia, the Megale Hellas, the Greek colonies. So the Middle Ages is just almost pointless in the eyes of many. But in Greece, it seems to be even worse. And as far as I know, there is still no society for medieval archaeology in Greece. There's a society for Byzantine studies that is a bit of a schizophrenic society, because there are medieval archaeologists and there are Paleo-Christian archaeologists and there are just Byzantine archaeologists, although they're few and far between, because of course they're the overriding influence for that period is still the text-based sources and not material culture. So I think it is a real problem if one wants to have a balanced overview. We can have a very imbalanced overview, but of course that's also a way of highlighting the problems, and that may be a way forward. So to answer the first part of your question, I do think that this sort of thing would be useful. I mean, your research agenda, working towards a research agenda. That's my view.
So you're suggesting a research agenda would be a good idea?
Yes, it may push people towards doing some of the right things, getting things in context and balance.
It's interesting. So I note one of the questions which actually came to you, Paul, in the chat, which was Hayley Winslade commenting that as an early modernist, she has a similar issue in dealing with the dominant Protestant narrative, the English Reformation, that refuses to see Catholicism as a belief system in Britain for around a millennium. Now, leaving aside the specifics of that issue, your comment about Tuscany being the only sort of southern Italian area which has got a consideration given the medieval period, there's a hint perhaps in some of this that our archaeology is still quite dominated by historical thinking, as it were, or textual thinking. And I guess that would probably apply to the classical archaeology as well as perhaps in the medieval period in Tuscany and perhaps to some of our other periods.
Well, I might just add to that at the moment I'm running a major project in southern Italy where I'm PI for 5 universities. And it's an Italian government-funded project called the Byzantine Heritage of Southern Italy. And the aim is to, I think the reason we were awarded the funds is because we said quite clearly, look, the Byzantine political domination in southern Italy lasted half a millennium, and it has been totally forgotten. It's in our DNA, or their DNA, in the food that's eaten, in the language, in religion, and so on and so on. And it would be also, I think, very, very interesting for the general public to understand their roots, and even for some added value to tourism. Now, the reason why these 500 years have been forgotten is, I think, largely to do with the Catholic Church and the 16th century Council of Trent, where it was decided that they didn't want anything Greek in Italy at all. It's now our country, and so we must abolish religion, we must abolish language, which lasted basically until the 19th century, and abolish anything which looks over the Adriatic. So there is certainly historical conditioning, historical religious, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. With an eye on the time, we're supposed to finish at 1 o'clock. We've already overrun a little bit. Aidan, do you have any final thoughts before we close, or any final questions quick questions you'd like to have addressed? I think Edith is still having problems with communication signal.
Yeah. And I know she's going to answer John Hunt's question by email and whatever. I think this would be a useful thing to iron out in any future publication. Might be a drawing together actually of ideas of practice and responses to infrastructure archaeology. My sense today, particularly from Italy, but also Croatia and Spain and whatever, is that some of the scales of infrastructural development are enormous. And Spain, like so many airports, and maybe the advantage that we had in Ireland being like in the Republic of Ireland, being a relatively small country, population of 5 million people, and a relatively small geographical area, but also the essential centralization of our archaeological legislation and control, is that when it came to the responses to our big infrastructural development in the late 1990s and all the way through to 2000s until the collapse, and now renewed again, because Irish commercial archaeology is now starting to boom again, was that we had a National Roads Authority, which then appointed archaeologists, an archaeology section, and then that archaeology section has several young archaeologists who themselves had already been experienced at archaeological excavation. They acted then to ensure that the government procurement of commercial archaeological mitigation was done to certain standards, was done to certain financial guidelines, was done under a full tendering process, all of that. So essentially you had a common response to all roadways under the National Roads Authority, and it's now called Transport Infrastructure Ireland. So there's no sense of regionalism, no sense of local responses, different strategies, different contexts. It's if there's a road going from here to there, it will do exactly the same thing no matter where it is on the island of Ireland. And the expectation for proper reporting, publication, and so on. And so Transport Infrastructure Ireland then had annual conference publications, had what's called scheme monographs. So if your roadway is called the M3 to Kells and Navan or whatever, that will actually have a publication of its own. And then most importantly, all publications that came around from all excavations from the National Infrastructural Development Programme are now lodged in the Digital Repository of Ireland. So all excavation reports, all grey literature are lodged and are accessible through a website. So in a sense, our data is available at your fingertips, and publications have come out, and then you also have a common policy or practice across all the schemes. My sense from all of these seminars is that isn't necessarily the case in every European country, that you can have a much more fragmented, sui generis local response depending on history and politics and attitudes and philosophies and so on. So that would be an interesting thing to draw out maybe towards the end of all of these seminars, would be what seems to work, and recognizing that you can't simply impose a new system on a country with its own political history or whatever, but you could be pointing out it's been done well in that country, that's been done well there, that's been done well in there, there's ideal practice.
So I think that's a really interesting point to finish on, because that question of scale of working is, you know, when you're looking at big states like Spain or Germany, both of whom have contributed to these seminars, you've got a very different situation to, as you say, someone like Italy, sorry, not Italy, Ireland, or indeed Portugal, where, you know, and I think Portugal and Ireland have had some similarities in scale of EU spending and what's been done with it, perhaps different responses. So we can pick all of these up. As I say, we will be looking at publishing this. I think I'm starting to sense that a big sort of final seminar, perhaps getting everyone together, might be a useful thing to do as well. So I'd like to finish then by thanking all of today's speakers and for the papers they've given, for the commentary that the panelists have offered, to Aidan for chairing the Q&A, and again tying us back into the first seminar as well, and that Irish example. The more different, it's almost like a kaleidoscope, isn't it? We've got all these different depths and patterns in our data, and our challenge is both to, now that it's been captured, is how to use it. But certainly it's showing that the potential for advancing knowledge and understanding of medieval rural settlements is absolutely vast, but we are at risk of not realising that potential through the lack of attention that's given to it. So thank you very much to everyone. The final of the 4 seminars will be in spring of next year. And as I said earlier, we'll be looking at Eastern Europe. We've got confirmed speakers from Hungary, from Poland and from Austria. And we're looking for one other to replace what would have been a Russian contribution, which is not possible to include now. So thank you very, very much, everybody. Have a great rest of your weekend. Please keep up to speed or get in touch with this seminar programme. It'd be wonderful if many of you who've spoken today or taken part today or listened today can take part in the final one and also help guide us as we pull all of this together. The importance of it, I think, is becoming more clear with each seminar. So thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.